December 26, 1944. A Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King crashes through German lines and into the besieged town of Bastogne. Inside that tank, Lieutenant Charles Boggis has just accomplished what military experts said was impossible. Behind him, General George S. Patton has wheeled an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter, moved over 133,000 vehicles through ice and snow, and reached the surrounded paratroopers in just 7 days. When he promised this feat to Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower at a crisis meeting 1 week earlier, the other generals in the room actually laughed. They thought he was insane. But now, as news reaches Eisenhower that Patton has done the impossible, what does the Supreme Commander say? The answer reveals one of the most complex and fascinating relationships in military history, a friendship forged in peacetime polo matches, tested by slapping incidents and media scandals, and ultimately defined by this single moment when everything was on the line. This is the untold story of what Eisenhower really said when Patton reached Bastogne first. And trust me, it's not what you think. December 16, 1944 was supposed to be a good day for Dwight Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe had just been promoted to 5-star general, one of only a handful of men in American history to achieve this rank. He was planning to attend the wedding of his driver, Mickey McKeer, at Versailles. Maybe grab some champagne. Smile for a few photos. Then his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, burst through the church doors, snow still clinging to his uniform. The Germans had launched a massive counter-offensive in the Ardennes forest of Belgium. Not a small raid, not a diversionary attack. This was Hitler's last gamble. 250,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks, smashing through the American lines in the one place the Allies thought was safest, the quiet sector. Within hours, Eisenhower grasped what his intelligence chiefs had missed. This wasn't just an attack, it was an existential threat. If the Germans broke through to Antwerp and captured that vital port, they could split the Allied armies in two and potentially force a negotiated peace. Everything they'd fought for since D-Day could be lost. By December 19th, Eisenhower knew he needed his most aggressive commander. He needed the one general who never met a fight he didn't want to start immediately. He needed George S. Patton, Jr. The meeting took place in a freezing cold schoolhouse in Verdun, France. Present were Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, Jacob Devers, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, and Patton. The room was gloomy, the weather outside was grey and miserable, and the tactical situation catastrophic. German panzers were racing toward the Meuse River. 2 entire American regiments had already surrendered. The crucial crossroads town of Bastogne was about to be surrounded, and across the Atlantic in the United States, panic was starting to spread as news of the German breakthrough reached the press. But Eisenhower refused to show fear. He stood before his commanders and declared, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us, and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." It was pure Eisenhower, calm under pressure, seeing the bigger picture even when everyone else saw doom. Then he turned to Patton. "George, I want you to abandon your plan to break through the Siegfried Line. You're going to have to take charge in Luxembourg and attack north toward Bastogne." Now you have to understand what he was asking. Patton's Third Army, over 250,000 men, thousands of vehicles and hundreds of tanks, was positioned along the Saar River, preparing to push into Germany. Eisenhower was asking him to disengage from that front, turn 90 degrees north, travel through ice and snow on roads clogged with retreating American troops, and counterattack into the German flank. In military terms, this was like asking someone to parallel park an aircraft carrier. Eisenhower asked, "How soon can you attack?" Patton's reply stopped everyone cold. "As soon as you're through with me." The other generals stared. What did that even mean? Patton clarified, "I can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd. That's in 3 days." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, according to witnesses, several officers actually laughed. They thought Patton was being his usual bombastic self, all bluster and bravado. Eisenhower was incredulous. "Don't be fatuous, George. If you try to go that early, you won't have all 3 divisions ready, and you'll go piecemeal." But Patton wasn't joking, and he wasn't being reckless. What nobody else in that room knew was that Patton had already prepared for this moment. Days earlier, sensing the German build-up, he'd instructed his staff to develop 3 contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Each plan had a code name: cent, nickel, and dime. Before leaving for the Verdun meeting, Patton had told his Chief of Staff, General Horace Hap Gay, to prepare operational orders for all 3 options. He'd written the code words on a piece of paper and handed them to Gay. Once Eisenhower told him which direction to attack, Patton would simply telephone his headquarters and say the code word. The movement was already underway. When Patton left the conference room and called his headquarters, he uttered just 2 words into the phone: "Play ball." Within hours, 3 entire divisions, the 4th Armored Division, the 81st Infantry Division, and the 26th Infantry Division, began one of the most remarkable movements in military history. The logistical challenge Patton faced cannot be overstated. Modern military analysts still study what he accomplished as one of the greatest feats of command in warfare. Consider the numbers. 133,178 vehicles needed to be redirected. Over 62,000 tons of supplies had to be moved. Each vehicle traveled an average of more than 11 miles just to reach the new assembly areas, and all of this had to happen in the middle of winter, on icy roads, in a war zone where German fighters could strafe convoys at any moment. The weather was brutal. Soldiers who were there described it as the coldest winter in living memory. Baseball Hall of Famer Warren Spahn, who served as a 22-year-old infantryman during the battle, later said, "I was from Buffalo. I thought I knew cold, but I really didn't know cold until the Battle of the Bulge." Truck engines had to be run every half hour just to keep the oil from congealing. Weapons froze. Men shared body warmth in foxholes, terrified that falling asleep might mean freezing to death. But Patton was relentless. He drove up and down the columns, appearing wherever his troops needed inspiration. In one remarkable scene, Patton found himself on a narrow highway where trucks carrying infantry of the 91st Division forward to battle passed ambulances bringing the wounded back. When the soldiers recognized Patton, they leaned out of their trucks, cheering wildly. Historian John Toland recorded what happened next. The general's face broke into a smile. He waved, but he could hardly hold back the tears. Tomorrow, many of those now cheering would be dead because of his orders. Later, Patton wrote that it was the most moving experience of my life. But Patton faced an enemy even more formidable than the Germans: the weather. Snow and fog had grounded the Allied air forces. Without air support, Patton's columns were vulnerable to German counterattacks, and the men trapped in Bastogne desperately needed supplies dropped from the air: ammunition, medicine, food. So Patton did something that perfectly captured his complex personality. This warrior, this profane general known for cursing a blue streak, turned to prayer. He summoned his chief chaplain, Colonel James Hugh O'Neill, and ordered him to compose a prayer for good weather. O'Neill obliged. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee, of thy great goodness, to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee, that, armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations. Amen." Patton had the prayer printed on cards and distributed to every man in the Third Army. And then, as if on cue, on December 23rd, the weather cleared. Crystal blue skies opened over the Ardennes. American fighter planes roared into action. Supply drops began reaching Bastogne. The air forces that had been grounded for days unleashed devastating attacks on German supply lines and armor. When the weather cleared, Patton called O'Neill to his headquarters and pinned a bronze star on his chest right there on the spot. The tip of Patton's spear was the 4th Armoured Division, and at the very point of that spear was the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the same Abrams who would later have the M1 Abrams tank named after him. Leading the 37th was a Sherman tank nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggis. The fighting was ferocious. On December 22nd, just as Patton had promised, his forces launched their attack. German resistance was murderous. In a single day, one battalion of the 4th Armoured lost 33 tanks to German anti-tank guns. Patton personally drove to the headquarters of 3rd Corps Commander Major General John Milliken and told him to drive like hell. He wanted Milliken close enough to the front to hear the bullets whistle. He demanded the attacks continue through the night, regardless of casualties, regardless of exhaustion. When Milliken expressed concern about the losses, Patton was unmoved. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division and other units trapped there, about 18,000 men, were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Every hour of delay meant more American casualties. The weather might have improved, but the fighting didn't get any easier. As the 37th Tank Battalion pushed toward Bastogne, they ran a gauntlet that Lieutenant Boggis later described as frighteningly reminiscent of a modern combat video game. German fire coming from every direction, tanks exploding, men dying. But they kept moving. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, one of the most famous moments of the entire war was unfolding. On December 22nd, 4 German soldiers approached American lines carrying a white flag. They bore a written ultimatum from German General Heinrich von Luttwitz, demanding that the Americans surrender. The message was ominous. The fortune of war is changing. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The ultimatum landed on the desk of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne Division. When McAuliffe read it, he initially responded with a single word that probably can't be repeated on YouTube. Then he paused and thought about what to officially write back. His typed response was just as blunt: "Nuts!" When the German officers received McAuliffe's reply, they were confused. They didn't understand the American slang. Colonel Joseph Harper had to explain, it means go to hell. The story spread like wildfire through the American forces. Here they were, surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, running low on everything, and their commander's response to a surrender demand was essentially not a chance. It became a rallying cry. The defenders of Bastogne would hold, but they needed Patton to get there fast. By Christmas Day, Patton's forces were close, agonizingly close, but not close enough. German resistance stiffened as they realized what Patton was attempting. The weather, briefly clear, turned nasty again. Back at Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower was receiving constant updates. The pressure on him was immense. This wasn't just a battle anymore. It had become a test of American resolve. If Bastogne fell, the psychological impact could be devastating. Eisenhower sent a message to Patton's headquarters. Eisenhower is very anxious that I put every effort on securing Bastogne. When Patton read the message, he was incredulous. He wrote in his diary that night, "What the hell does he think I've been doing for the last week?" His frustration was understandable. His men were dying by the dozens every hour. He was pushing them beyond exhaustion. And someone at headquarters felt the need to remind him that Bastogne was important. But Patton kept the pressure on. On December 26th, 10 days after the German offensive began, exactly 7 days after the Verdun meeting, Lieutenant Boggis and Cobra King broke through. The scene was chaotic. German fire was coming from all directions. Boggis's tank pushed through the village of Eisenhower, firing at everything that moved. Behind him, infantry cleared houses and streets. At approximately 4:50 p.m., Cobra King made contact with the 326th Engineer Battalion, part of the forces defending Bastogne. The siege was broken. News of the breakthrough raced up the chain of command. Patton was elated, calling it the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed, and in my opinion, the outstanding achievement of this war. But what did Eisenhower say? Here's where the story gets really interesting, because the answer reveals the complexity of their relationship and the reality of high command during wartime. The truth is, Eisenhower's immediate reaction wasn't a grand speech or a dramatic telegram. It was something far more pragmatic and, in its own way, more revealing. During the preceding days, as Patton fought toward Bastogne, Eisenhower had been receiving frustrating progress reports. The advance was slower than hoped, casualties were mounting, and Patton, being Patton, felt compelled to call Eisenhower personally several times. According to Eisenhower's later recollection, these conversations followed a pattern. Patton would call and say, "General, I apologize for my slowness. This snow is god-awful, I'm sorry." And Eisenhower, demonstrating the leadership that made him Supreme Commander, would reply with the same question each time. "George, are you still fighting?" When Patton confirmed he was, Eisenhower would answer, "All right, that's all I've asked of you." Think about that for a moment. Eisenhower wasn't demanding miracles. He wasn't screaming about timelines or threatening relief of command. He was simply asking, "Are you still in the fight?" Because Eisenhower understood something fundamental about warfare that many armchair generals miss. Battles are messy, plans fall apart, timetables slip, the enemy gets a vote. What matters is whether your commanders keep pushing forward despite the setbacks. Several weeks after the relief, once the immediate crisis had passed and the Battle of the Bulge was winding down, Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton met again in Bastogne itself. There's a famous photograph from February 1945 showing the three generals standing together in the rubble of the town they'd fought so hard to save. They're in their winter uniforms surrounded by devastation. And in that photograph, if you look closely at their faces, you can see something remarkable: mutual respect. These were three very different men. Eisenhower, the diplomat general who'd learned to navigate the treacherous waters of coalition warfare. Bradley, the steady professional, nicknamed the GI's general for his methodical competence. And Patton, the warrior poet who believed he'd been reincarnated from ancient battles and who drove his men with a mixture of inspiration and intimidation. But in Bastogne, standing among the ruins, they shared something profound. They'd just won one of the most desperate battles in American military history. According to those who were present, Eisenhower's words to Patton during that visit were simple but meaningful. "George, you saved the day." Not a movie speech, not a dramatic proclamation for the history books. Just 5 words acknowledging an extraordinary achievement. But there was something else Eisenhower said during the Battle of the Bulge that perhaps best captures his view of what Patton accomplished. At the Verdun meeting, when Patton predicted he could reach Bastogne in his first rush, Eisenhower told him, "As long as you're advancing, I'll be satisfied." That was the real answer to what Eisenhower said. Not when Patton reached Bastogne, but before, when it mattered most. Eisenhower gave Patton the mission, the resources, and most importantly, the trust to execute. To understand what Eisenhower really thought about Patton's achievement at Bastogne, you have to understand their relationship, which was far more complex than most people realize. They'd known each other for decades. Both had been young officers in the years after World War I. They'd played polo together. Patton had even convinced Eisenhower to buy a sailboat with him. They'd been friends before they were commanders, but their relationship had been tested severely. In August 1943, during the Sicily campaign, Patton had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from what we'd now call PTSD, but was then called battle fatigue. He accused them of cowardice and struck them in front of medical personnel and other patients. When Eisenhower learned of the incidents, he was furious, not just because of what Patton had done, but because it threatened to derail the entire Allied war effort. Journalist Drew Pearson broke the story in November 1943, and suddenly America's most aggressive general was also its most controversial. Eisenhower could have fired Patton right then. Many urged him to, but he didn't. Why? Because Eisenhower understood something that gets lost in the Hollywood version of history. War isn't just about following rules or maintaining good PR. It's about winning, and Patton, for all his flaws, won battles. Eisenhower forced Patton to apologize, which he did multiple times, to the soldiers, to the medical staff, and to his entire army. Then Eisenhower assigned Patton to Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign to make Hitler believe the D-Day invasion would come at Calais instead of Normandy. When Patton finally got back to combat command, leading the Third Army in the breakout from Normandy, he proved Eisenhower's faith was justified. His armored columns raced across France faster than anyone thought possible. But the relationship remained complicated. Patton chafed at what he saw as Eisenhower's caution. Eisenhower grew tired of Patton's political tone deafness and his tendency to cause public relations nightmares. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. Here's the thing most histories miss. Eisenhower's response to Patton reaching Bastogne wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a series of interactions that revealed a mature, nuanced leadership style. First, at the Verdun meeting, when other generals laughed at Patton's promise, Eisenhower challenged him but ultimately gave him the green light. That was trust. Second, during the advance, when Patton called with apologies for being slow, Eisenhower never expressed disappointment, only support. That was wisdom. Third, when Patton broke through, Eisenhower's headquarters sent messages of congratulations, but also immediately began planning the next phase of operations. That was professionalism. And fourth, weeks later in Bastogne, Eisenhower's simple acknowledgement, "George, you saved the day," carried the weight of genuine respect. But perhaps the most telling moment came at the Verdun meeting itself, at the very end. As they were wrapping up, Eisenhower made a joke. He'd just been promoted to 5-star general, and he quipped to Patton, "George, every time I get promoted, I get attacked." Patton shot back instantly, "And every time you get attacked, Ike, I pull you out." Everyone in the room laughed, but it was true. This wasn't just banter between old friends. It was an acknowledgement of their symbiotic relationship. Eisenhower, the strategic thinker and coalition manager. Patton, the tactical genius and aggressive executor. They needed each other. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of Patton's relief of Bastogne and forget the human cost. The 101st Airborne Division suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing during the siege. The 4th Armored Division lost hundreds more breaking through. Overall, American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge exceeded 80,000, with more than 19,000 dead. The Germans suffered even worse, over 100,000 casualties, including thousands of their best remaining troops and irreplaceable tanks and equipment. For every famous story about Patton or McAuliffe, there were thousands of unnamed soldiers fighting in frozen foxholes, manning roadblocks, or dying in burning tanks. When Patton's columns moved forward to battle, passing ambulances bringing the wounded back, and those young soldiers cheered their general even knowing many of them would die the next day, that's the real story of Bastogne. Not the generals, not the plans, not the headquarters, the soldiers. Today, if you visit Bastogne, you'll find monuments to the Battle of the Bulge everywhere. There's the Mardeson Memorial, a star-shaped monument that honors all American soldiers who fought in the Ardennes. There's the Bastogne War Museum. And throughout the town, there are markers showing where key events took place. But the most visited grave isn't in Bastogne itself. It's at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, where more than 5,000 American soldiers are buried in perfect rows of white crosses. At the head of one section, there's a single grave marked by 4 stars instead of the standard marker, General George S. Patton, Jr. He chose to be buried there alongside the men who died under his command, not in America, not at West Point, but in Europe, with his soldiers. After his death in a car accident in December 1945, Patton's wife Beatrice said he would have wanted to be buried with the men of the Third Army. So that's where he rests, the only four-star general among those perfect rows. It's fitting in a way. The general who drove his men so relentlessly, who demanded so much, who pushed them through hell to reach Bastogne, he wanted to remain with them. So what did Eisenhower say when Patton reached Bastogne? The truthful answer is several things at different times in different contexts. Not a single dramatic line, but a series of interactions that revealed a mature, sophisticated understanding of command. He expressed trust before the operation. As long as you're advancing, I'll be satisfied. He provided support during the operation. Are you still fighting? All right, that's all I've asked of you. He offered acknowledgement after. George, you saved the day. But more than any specific words, Eisenhower's response was to give Patton what every commander needs most: the mission, the resources, and the freedom to execute. That's the real lesson of Bastogne. Not that Patton was a genius, though he was brilliant at mobile warfare. Not that Eisenhower was soft, though his management style emphasized support over criticism, but that their partnership, forged over decades and tested by war, allowed them to achieve something neither could have done alone. Eisenhower saw the strategic opportunity when others saw disaster. Patton executed an operational masterpiece. Together, they turned Hitler's last great gamble into a decisive Allied victory. But the story of Bastogne raises questions that echo through military history. Could anyone else have done what Patton did? Probably not. His particular combination of aggressive tactics, inspirational leadership, and meticulous planning was unique. Could Patton have succeeded without Eisenhower's support? Definitely not. Without Eisenhower running interference with the British, managing logistics and maintaining strategic focus, Patton would have had neither the resources nor the authority to act. Was the relief of Bastogne the decisive moment of the Battle of the Bulge? Historians debate this. The Germans never recovered their momentum after the weather cleared and Allied air power returned. The stubborn defense of the northern shoulder was equally important. But Bastogne became the symbol, the moment when American resilience trumped German desperation. There's a scene that perfectly captures the Patton-Eisenhower relationship, one that happened at the Verdun meeting but isn't widely known. As Patton was walking Eisenhower out to his vehicle, a sergeant from a medical battalion rolled up in a jeep. This wasn't a medical emergency. The sergeant just wanted his picture taken with the two most famous generals in Europe. Eisenhower could have refused. He'd just orchestrated a response to the largest crisis of the European theatre. But instead he agreed immediately. Then he told Patton, "George, move over and let the soldier in the middle." It's such a small moment, but it reveals so much about Eisenhower's understanding that leadership means putting the soldiers first, about his relationship with Patton, comfortable enough to order him around for a photo, about both men's recognition that they were servants of something larger than themselves. The photo exists somewhere in archives, probably. Two generals and one sergeant standing in the snow outside a cold schoolhouse in Verdun, smiling for the camera while the greatest battle in American military history raged just miles away. That's the real story of what Eisenhower said when Patton reached Bastogne. Not in words, but in actions. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet confidence between two men who'd known each other for decades and who, despite their differences, trusted each other when everything was on the line. Patton reached Bastogne first because Eisenhower gave him the chance, and Eisenhower's Allied coalition survived the Battle of the Bulge because Patton delivered when it mattered most. That's what leadership looks like. Not movie speeches or dramatic declarations, but two professionals doing their jobs at the highest possible level when the stakes couldn't be higher. 7 days to change history. 133,000 vehicles, 250,000 men, and a friendship tested by fire that helped save the world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most dramatic moments, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think anyone else could have done what Patton did at Bastogne? And what do you think was Eisenhower's most important quality as Supreme Commander? Next week, we're exploring another incredible story from the Battle of the Bulge, the time an entire German unit infiltrated American lines disguised as GIs, and how they were caught by one simple question about baseball. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching.